December 24, 1944. The small village of Gleize, tucked deep within the Ardennes forest, lay under a heavy, almost suffocating blanket of snow and ice. The winter had been relentless, freezing rivers and choking the roads with mud turned solid, a treacherous mix that slowed even the most powerful machines of war. For weeks, the German army had been advancing through Belgium, launching what would become one of the last major offensives of World War II, the Battle of the Bulge. Their armored columns, once symbols of invincibility and fear across Europe, now struggled against a landscape that seemed determined to halt them. Tanks, which had dominated battlefields from France to the Eastern Front, creaked and groaned as they attempted to move along narrow village streets and frozen fields, their engines straining, their tracks slipping on ice. German crews, trained for speed and shock, found themselves navigating a frozen trap. Every turn was dangerous, every misstep potentially fatal. The villagers of Gleize, watching from shuttered windows and behind snow-draped fences, could hardly believe the chaos unfolding outside. The thunder of engines echoed through the trees, a low, ominous rumble that seemed to shake the frozen ground itself. Civilians held their breath as the armored columns inched forward, their advance slowed not by enemy fire, but by mud, ice, and the cruel geometry of narrow roads. It was a battlefield transformed by winter, where nature itself had become a weapon against even the most formidable armored machines. American soldiers, observing the advancing Germans from hidden positions, understood this better than anyone. They faced heavily armored tanks, seemingly unstoppable, yet their enemy was now predictable, constrained by terrain and weather. Commanders on both sides moved with caution, issuing orders that balanced aggression with survival. For the Americans, outnumbered and outgunned in some sectors, every decision carried enormous weight. Observation became as critical as firepower. Soldiers studied the frozen roads, the muddy fields, and the narrow alleys of Gleize for weaknesses in the German advance. They looked for the places where tanks could be trapped, where improvisation could turn the tables. The icy conditions, which the Germans hoped would aid mobility, had instead created a labyrinth of obstacles. Tanks forced into single-file lines along narrow roads became vulnerable. Each immobilized vehicle could block the next, creating a chain reaction that could bring an entire column to a standstill. The seemingly invincible force of Hitler's armored divisions was now slowed to a crawl, a lumbering, vulnerable procession of steel and iron. In this frozen chaos, the potential for creativity and ingenuity emerged. Ordinary soldiers, armed not with expensive weapons, but with ropes, cables, and scrap materials, could make a difference in ways that traditional artillery never could. It was a moment when improvisation became as deadly as strategy. Every frozen ditch, every icy patch of road, every snowdrift could be exploited. Even the harsh winter, usually an obstacle, became an ally for those willing to think differently. The village itself, with its tight streets and narrow approaches, amplified these opportunities. What might have been minor obstacles in a normal battlefield now transformed into major tactical advantages. As the day wore on, tension built on both sides. German crews, aware that any delay could prove fatal to their offensive, pushed their machines harder, unaware that the environment had already set traps in motion. American soldiers prepared, silently, to capitalize on every misstep. The stage was set for an unusual kind of combat, one where the interplay of human creativity and environmental conditions would define the outcome. The frozen village of Gleize, small and seemingly insignificant, became a crucible for this ingenuity. Ordinary men, in extraordinary circumstances, were about to show that even the mightiest war machines could be challenged not through overwhelming firepower, but through clever thinking and relentless determination. In the bitter cold of that December, the line between victory and defeat was no longer defined solely by tanks and guns, but by the ability to adapt, to see opportunity where others saw only obstacles, and to turn the harshest conditions of war to one's advantage. By evening, the village, silent beneath the falling snow, had already begun to tell a story that few would forget. The roar of engines would be replaced by the grinding halt of tanks, the frozen roads claiming vehicles that once seemed unstoppable. Soldiers, civilians, and commanders alike were witnessing a moment that would later be remembered not for grand strategy, but for the power of simple, inventive solutions in desperate times. In the frozen chaos of Gleize, the stage was set for an extraordinary lesson in ingenuity, courage, and the unexpected ways in which a harsh winter could reshape the battlefield.
The story of Gleize was not just about frozen roads and immobilized tanks. It was about the power of human ingenuity under pressure. American soldiers, many of them young and inexperienced, found themselves facing some of the most advanced armored vehicles of the German army. These tanks, heavy and formidable, were designed to crush opposition and dominate the battlefield. Yet here they were, slowed and constrained by narrow streets, icy mud, and the winter forest. Faced with a seemingly insurmountable threat, the soldiers did something remarkable. They looked around them, assessed the tools at hand, and realized that even the simplest materials could become weapons. Ropes, steel cables, scrap metal, and chains, items that would normally seem mundane, became instruments of destruction in skilled hands. Soldiers moved quietly under the cover of snow and shadows, approaching the massive vehicles with courage bordering on recklessness. They would jam ropes and chains into the tracks of the advancing tanks, looping cables around sprockets and wheels, pulling with all their strength to create jams that would halt the engines. The tanks, once symbols of unstoppable force, ground to a halt, trapped like giants in the icy grip of the Ardennes. It was a simple idea, yet profoundly effective. What made it even more dangerous and yet more brilliant was the proximity required. Men had to work dangerously close to live tanks, risking machine gun fire, grenades, and even the tank's own guns. Each successful immobilization required nerves of steel and absolute precision. Once the vehicles were stopped, the battlefield itself seemed to conspire with the soldiers. The narrow roads meant that one trapped tank could block an entire column, forcing the following vehicles to pile up in confusion. The snow and ice magnified the chaos, slowing any attempts to maneuver or reverse. Commanders on the German side struggled to adapt, but there were few options. Their pride in armored might could not overcome the constraints of terrain and improvisation. American soldiers exploited this advantage immediately, marking immobilized tanks for artillery or demolition teams who could strike with deadly effect once the machines were vulnerable. The combination of human creativity and environmental pressure transformed ordinary men into architects of destruction. It was not only mechanical skill that mattered, it was timing, observation, and the ability to anticipate enemy reactions. Soldiers had to gauge exactly when to strike, how to manipulate their tools, and how to avoid detection. Small squads worked like a single organism, communicating silently through hand signals, watching for every flicker of a turret or movement of a tread. The tension was relentless. A single mistake could mean death, yet every successful action brought immense satisfaction, a sense of mastery over a machine that had once seemed invincible. In this way, the soldiers were rewriting the rules of armored combat. The ingenuity did not end with ropes and chains. Teams devised clever ways to amplify their impact, using wedges, timber, and even frozen debris to jam tracks further. Improvisation extended to every aspect of their work, moving quietly in snow, hiding materials in plain sight, and using the frozen village itself as part of the trap. By the afternoon, the once feared German tanks were reduced to a staggering lineup of immobile steel, each vehicle a testament to the effectiveness of simple, low-cost tools when combined with human skill. The 50-cent weapon, as it would later be called, was less about money and more about cleverness, demonstrating that innovation is often born of necessity. Stories began to circulate among the troops. One tank, trapped along a narrow street, had its treads jammed by a rope and chain combination, causing 3 following tanks to pile up behind it. Another vehicle, unable to turn, blocked a road for hours until demolition charges were set. These were not isolated incidents. They were repeated across the frozen village, creating a chain reaction that paralyzed a major portion of the German advance. What began as a small-scale improvisation became a tactical revolution, showing that knowledge, courage, and creativity could equalize power on the battlefield. By evening, the soldiers could see the results of their ingenuity clearly. Columns of German tanks lay trapped in mud and snow, some abandoned by crews who realized escape was impossible, others marked for destruction by artillery. The battlefield had shifted dramatically, not because of overwhelming firepower, but because of small, clever actions performed at exactly the right moment. In the cold quiet of Gleize, the ingenuity of a few men had transformed the course of a larger battle, proving that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the combination of courage and creativity could level the playing field. The frozen roads, once a simple obstacle, had become a weapon in itself, magnified by human initiative. The soldiers, using ropes, cables, and scrap metal, had turned desperation into innovation, halting a powerful armored force with tools that cost almost nothing but demanded everything from the men who wielded them. Once the tanks were immobilized, the battlefield shifted dramatically. What had seemed like unstoppable machines, the pride of the German army, were now vulnerable and exposed. American soldiers didn't just stop at jamming tracks, they quickly turned each trapped vehicle into a target. Anti-tank guns were moved into position, artillery crews prepared demolition charges, and machine gunners observed every opening, ready to strike. The frozen roads and narrow streets of Gleize amplified the effect. One blocked tank could halt an entire column, forcing dozens of vehicles to pile up behind it, trapped in a steel traffic jam that left crews frustrated and exposed. Soldiers quickly realized that immobilizing a tank was only the first step. They had to ensure it could not be freed before firepower reached it. Teams used wedges, timber, and even the debris of war itself to wedge tanks in place, amplifying the effectiveness of the improvised weapon. The frozen mud and snow worked as additional restraints, creating conditions that no tank could overcome on its own. German crews tried desperately to extricate their vehicles. They shoveled, pushed, and attempted to restart engines, but every effort was slowed by the winter conditions and by the clever placement of obstacles. American artillery teams took full advantage. With the enemy immobilized, they could aim with precision, striking vulnerable points on the tank's hulls or turrets. Demolition teams, equipped with small charges, were able to destroy engines or tracks without engaging in a direct firefight. What might have been a costly engagement in the open battlefield became almost surgical in its efficiency. Every tank that was immobilized and targeted added to the chaos of the German line, creating panic among crews who had once believed their machines invincible. The psychological impact was enormous. Tank crews, seeing their peers trapped and destroyed, often abandoned their vehicles rather than risk death, leaving advanced armor stranded in the snow. This method of turning immobilized tanks into easy targets was repeated across Gleize. In one notable instance, a single immobilized tank blocked an entire street, creating a choke point that stopped 4 more vehicles in their tracks. Artillery shells hit their targets with precision, forcing crews to flee. The village itself became a deadly maze of steel, ice, and debris. What began as improvisation had grown into a coordinated tactical advantage. Soldiers discovered that even a small team, armed with only cables, chains, and a keen understanding of terrain, could inflict damage far exceeding the apparent cost or risk. The ingenuity extended beyond simple jamming techniques. Scouts observed German patterns and predicted which tanks would be forced into choke points next.
They moved quietly through snowdrifts, signaling teams to prepare for another immobilization. In some cases, the Americans even used decoys or noise to draw tanks into the narrowest roads where they could be trapped more efficiently. Each success fed into the next, a cascade of clever actions that compounded the effect. Tanks became not just targets, but obstacles to each other, and the battlefield itself became a weapon in the hands of those who knew how to manipulate it. By late afternoon, it was clear that German forces were in trouble. Columns that had begun the day with confidence now crawled forward slowly, hindered by vehicles they could no longer move. The Americans had transformed the frozen village into a deadly trap, one where each immobilized tank amplified the danger for the next. Every jammed engine and immobilized tread served as both a physical and psychological weapon, turning the mightiest armored units into sitting ducks. In this way, ingenuity and quick thinking were more powerful than brute force. The success of these tactics in Gleize proved a timeless lesson. Even the most advanced technology can be neutralized by clever adaptation, especially when combined with an intimate understanding of terrain and timing. The frozen village, with its narrow streets, ice-covered roads, and immovable obstacles, became a proving ground for innovation under pressure. Each tank that became a target was another demonstration that courage, observation, and creativity could outmatch raw power. The once unstoppable German armored columns were now exposed, fragile, and vulnerable, a testament to the deadly efficiency of simple, well-applied ingenuity.
As the day wore on in Gleize, the trapped German tanks became more than just immobilized machines. They became symbols of a desperate situation that was spiraling out of control. The armored columns that had entered the village with confidence now faced an impossible reality. Roads clogged with snow, ice, and debris made maneuvering nearly impossible, and each blocked tank created a cascading effect, trapping more vehicles behind it. Fuel supplies dwindled rapidly as engines struggled against frozen mud, and crews soon realized that continuing forward was no longer an option. The once proud symbols of German military power now lay stranded, exposed, and vulnerable in the bitter winter cold. German officers frantically searched for solutions. They attempted to free the jammed tanks by coordinating teams to push and pull, but the narrow streets of Gleize, combined with the weight of the vehicles and the icy terrain, made every effort slow and dangerous. Time became the enemy. Every minute that passed allowed American forces to observe, plan, and strike. Soldiers who had been immobilizing tanks earlier now watched as the situation grew increasingly chaotic. Explosions of artillery and demolition charges echoed through the village, marking each immobilized vehicle for destruction and sending waves of panic through crews who realized that escape might no longer be possible. The human toll became evident as crews faced impossible choices. Soldiers inside the tanks could see their own comrades trapped ahead and behind them, and with narrow escape routes blocked, panic set in. In some cases, tank commanders gave the order to abandon their vehicles to avoid capture. They climbed into the snow, leaving behind vehicles that had cost a small fortune to produce and were considered some of the most formidable weapons of the war. Others were forced to destroy their own tanks, setting demolition charges to ensure they would not fall into enemy hands. What had started as a powerful offensive ended as a chaotic collection of abandoned steel, a testament to the crushing effects of desperation in combat. American soldiers observed the unfolding scene with a mix of awe and urgency. The frozen village, once a strategic point, had become a battleground where clever improvisation, environmental advantage, and relentless observation combined to neutralize the enemy. Each abandoned tank added to the disorder, creating additional choke points and obstacles. Soldiers on both sides understood that the momentum of the day had shifted entirely. The Germans' armored strength, once thought unstoppable, was now scattered and vulnerable. What had begun as a swift offensive had ground to a near halt, and the soldiers on the ground understood that winter, terrain, and ingenuity had teamed up to level the playing field. Fuel shortages were not minor inconvenience, they were catastrophic. Tanks require enormous amounts of fuel, and with roads clogged and engines idling while crews attempted to free vehicles, fuel ran out quickly. Without fuel, engines would not restart, guns would not traverse, and mobility became impossible. Crews who had been confident in their armored superiority were suddenly faced with immobility, turning what should have been a forceful strike into a paralyzed column. Each immobilized tank became a risk to the next, creating a chain reaction that could not be undone. The once feared German tanks had become liabilities in the snow, forcing soldiers to make split-second decisions under extreme pressure. As the day progressed, the sense of desperation grew. German soldiers struggled not just against American forces, but against nature itself. Ice and mud became enemies of the machines they had relied upon, and each trapped tank highlighted the limits of even the most advanced technology when faced with harsh conditions and creative opponents. American forces, meanwhile, continued to exploit every opportunity. Teams moved quickly, setting charges and preparing artillery strikes while watching the frozen columns. The immobilized tanks were no longer threats, they were targets, and every successful action amplified the pressure on the remaining German forces. By evening, the impact of fuel shortages, blocked roads, and trapped vehicles was undeniable. German crews, realizing escape was nearly impossible, either abandoned their vehicles or destroyed them in place. The once unstoppable armored columns had become a frozen tableau of steel and desperation, and the American soldiers who had engineered these results had done so without expensive weapons, relying on observation, ingenuity, and timing. The Battle of Gleize, which had begun as a fierce armored offensive, had been transformed by improvisation and harsh winter conditions into a stunning example of how resourcefulness and courage could neutralize overwhelming force. In those frozen streets, ordinary men achieved extraordinary results, proving that even the most powerful war machines could be rendered useless when faced with determination, creativity, and the unforgiving realities of winter warfare.
By the end of the day in Gleize, the battlefield looked almost unrecognizable. Tanks that had inspired fear for months now lay stranded in snow and mud, abandoned by crews or destroyed to prevent capture. What had started as a German offensive intended to break Allied lines and regain momentum had collapsed into a chaotic tableau of steel and frozen ground. The American soldiers, who had improvised with ropes, cables, and scrap metal, had achieved something remarkable. They had transformed the battlefield without a single expensive or advanced weapon. Their creativity and courage had turned desperation into opportunity, showing that sometimes the simplest tools can have the most devastating effects. The frozen village itself had become a weapon. Narrow streets, icy roads, and muddy fields amplified the effect of every immobilized tank. Each blocked vehicle not only slowed the Germans, but created a chain reaction that paralyzed entire columns. Soldiers moving quietly through the snow could anticipate enemy movements, setting traps that made escape nearly impossible. Tanks that had once represented invincibility were now sitting ducks, vulnerable to artillery, demolition charges, and the relentless observation of determined troops. This was a stark reminder that technology alone does not guarantee success. Understanding the environment, timing, and human initiative can level even the most uneven battles. As German crews abandoned their vehicles, morale plummeted. The psychological impact of seeing comrades' tanks disabled or destroyed was immense. Each crew that fled left behind a machine that had cost thousands of marks, consumed countless hours of labor, and embodied the pride of an army. The soldiers' frustration and helplessness were compounded by fuel shortages, blocked escape routes, and the growing realization that their offensive had stalled completely.
In those frozen hours, the mightiest machines in the German arsenal were rendered ineffective, not through conventional firepower, but through a combination of ingenuity, observation, and environmental advantage. For the American soldiers, the results were as much about pride and morale as strategy. They had turned limited resources into a tactical advantage, demonstrating that even a small team, armed with nothing more than ropes, cables, and quick thinking, could alter the course of a larger battle. The lessons of Gleize were clear. Resourcefulness, courage, and adaptability can triumph over sheer force. In a world dominated by machines, the human mind remained the ultimate weapon. The 50-cent weapon was never about money. It was about creativity, daring, and using what was at hand to achieve extraordinary results. In the aftermath, the frozen village stood as a testament to ingenuity under pressure. German armor, once feared across Europe, had been stopped in its tracks not by artillery barrages or massed infantry assaults, but by small, clever actions repeated at exactly the right moments. Every immobilized tank, every abandoned vehicle told a story of courage, quick thinking, and the ability to exploit opportunity when the enemy least expected it. Soldiers who had been ordinary men just hours before were now participants in an extraordinary sequence of events, demonstrating that innovation often arises from necessity, especially in the harshest conditions. Looking back, the events at Gleize serve as a vivid reminder that desperation often breeds creativity. A few determined men, using simple tools and careful observation, managed to paralyze an elite armored force and turn the tide in a small but critical sector of the Battle of the Bulge. The frozen roads, the icy mud, and the narrow streets of the village became as powerful as any gun, proving that environment and ingenuity can combine to equal or even surpass raw strength. It was a moment when ordinary soldiers achieved something extraordinary, leaving a lasting lesson for future generations about the power of quick thinking, courage, and the relentless drive to turn adversity into advantage. By the time night fell over Gleize, the German advance had ground to a halt. The 50-cent weapon, improvised and unassuming, had earned its place in history, a symbol of how simplicity, combined with ingenuity and daring, can cripple even the most powerful machines. In the bitter cold of that December day, ordinary men had shown that creativity, courage, and persistence could triumph where brute force alone had failed. The frozen streets, the abandoned tanks, and the ingenuity of soldiers became a story of resilience and innovation, a story that would be remembered long after the snow had melted and the echoes of battle had faded into history.